Hello again, and you're all very welcome to this fourth edition of RighttoChange Radio podcast. And this week, I give a very warm welcome to Conor McCabe, who's going to talk to us about all sorts of things, but mostly focusing on a paper that Unite the Union brought out a couple of weeks ago called Hungry Bellies. And it's all really about inequality in Ireland today. So, without further ado, very, very warm RighttoChange welcome to Conor McCabe. How are you doing, Conor?
Grant.
I've read this report. I watched a video podcast, or whatever we call them nowadays, a Zoom meeting a few weeks ago, and it makes for. It's not like that we're not aware of a lot of this. Those of us on the left are aware of it, but I suppose it's very important to make other people aware of it. People who will perhaps just accept the results of these surveys as they come along.
Yeah, the kind of report, but for myself, it's really about like just passing on some of the kind of tricks of the trade that are used by kind of economists and by journalists. I just want to deal with kind of data and like surveys, and kind of like show these and show how they're being used by economists.
And indeed, how they get their information, it's almost like a political poll that decides to ring up a very limited demographic, a very limited number of people, and then, present you with, well, guess what, the government's on a 45% satisfaction rating. And that seems to be fairly much what was done with a lot of those reports about the inequality.
Yeah, the surveys that are used, but they do have a role to play. But the data, but the data in them is quite sensitive, to kind of variation. That's all lost when kind of media get their hands on it. They take what are sensitive and very conversational conclusions, and then they treat them as if they're written in like stone, and there's a problem with that because really what they're at, I argue, is that they're using these surveys to really give a kind of prearranged answer.
Yes, the answer that they wanted to find is the answer that they come up with.
Yeah. So no matter what the question is, the answer is like capitalism, Mm-hmm. So that's the whole kind of shtick,
Yeah, but like, okay, I'll put a question to you now. That's fair enough. You know that, and I know that. Chap comes into his living room, turns on RTE, opens up the Irish Times in the morning, right? He just sees that, he accepts it to a greater or lesser extent. What can we do? What can we do about that? Because these are the big wheels, if you like, of the media.
Yeah, this is where it gets into kind of roll up kind of self-education and providing our own kind of systems, our kind of information and kind of analysis, like we're never going to get a kind of progressive analysis from media in Ireland. So what we should do then is just work on our own, kind of analysis and their own ways of actually getting it out there, which is what you might have done, in like providing space for this report. That's part of that process. It's a very long kind of process. It's quite slow, but I can't see any other way kind of around it. So until we start kind of building up our own kind of analysis, that is factual. That is kind of factual based. That's the only way I can see a really kind of challenging that, and then kind of working on our own, kind of systems of kind of media and of kind of news kind of kind of stuff as well.
Indeed. So listen, just for a small break from it all there, from the serious talk, Conor, have you a piece of music you'd like us to listen to?
Yeah, I'd like to go with the there was a song by kind of Josephine Foster called "My Little Life." She's a US kind of folk singer. And it's a song which I really like.
Little love, how did you be so lucky? Little love, how did you be so glad? Songs arrive even in the mailbox. Songs keep coming, even happy to be sad. If you were a bird, how would you fly? If you were a butterfly, if you were a penguin under the sea. If you were a bumblebee.
There's that beautiful song by Josephine Foster. Fades away into the distance there. We welcome back Conor McCabe, and we're going to talk about our housing crisis, our homeless crisis, which is the same thing but slightly different. I noticed in the report it says 34.4% of renters, up from 27.4%, living in deprivation. That's despite the fact that people are telling us, well, inequality is falling, right? 1 in 5 children living in deprivation. And a point you're making that says if you've no money left after paying your rent, your food, well, you're poor.
Yeah, this goes back to the argument that's been made that that income inequality is falling in Ireland. Like the survey that says that also shows that kind of poverty and deprivation is rising. So it's where it gets into issues around kind of these surveys. They're saying kind of contradictory kind of things. But what we do see is that, and this is no surprise given just, how Ireland has been run just in the last kind of 15, 20 years. But kind of deprivation is on the rise at the moment. And one of the biggest kind of concerns, apart from kind of wages, is of course housing. Now, since the crash of kind of 2008, we've seen a shift in the overall kind of dynamic of housing in Ireland. There's less housing being built. There's even less social housing being built. So what's happening is that the government is, and this is just regardless of the Kilzane, if it's Fianna Fáil or kind of Fine Gael, they're pushing people more and more into a rental kind of market, and one that is highly kind of privatised. So that even when the state says that it's investing in like social housing, what it's doing is that it's just renting housing off of private landlords and calling it social housing. So it's actually just paying them kind of rents from the taxpayers' money. And that's an overt kind of strategy. So instead of the state expanding the public rental kind of sector, it's expanding the private rental ones, and where people can't afford that, in the state is kind of subsidising those rents. That helps people kind of short term, but the long term kind of effect is to lower the amount of actual social housing that's in the state, and the less kind of social housing you have, that puts more pressure on the private housing kind of market. So instead of going for a balance of around 60-40 private kind of public, at the moment around 3% of households are in what we would consider as being public housing. That is, it's owned and run by kind of local kind of authorities.
Yes.
So 97% isn't.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of this is well thought out though, because I mean I remember actually listening to your good self talking one day up in the teachers' club, commenting on the fact that, and I'm not going to speak up for them, but at once upon a time, Fianna Fáil were looked upon as the party of the working class. You know, and like
Yeah, yeah,
during their tenure, a lot of those houses were built.
yeah. I mean, like when Cabra in Dublin was built in the 1930s, which is one of the first of the Fianna Fáil kind of like platforms. It built kind of Crumlin and it built kind of Cabra. But like Sean Lamass turned the first sod out in Cabra, and like when he did, he made a speech saying that not only is he proud to be building, kind of state-owned kind of,
Yeah,
kind of council housing, but all the workers who are working on these, and they're all trade unionists, and it's all trade union rates. The
yeah,
change is absolutely
gracious.
kind of amazing. I
Yeah,
mean, like, how now going to Fianna Fáil and like Fine Gael push this bogus self-employment in the construction. Ireland starts selling off public housing first for kind of rural tenants. They could buy out a council house from the 1880s onwards. But in terms of urban housing, it's the 1967, I think it is, or the 66 Housing Act. Fianna Fáil starts selling off kind of corporate housing, and not kind of replacing it at the level that's been sold off on. Um, Also,
and can I
councils,
ask, Conor,
yeah.
what was their thinking behind that?
No, it was seen as this is well. First of all, they sold them off extremely cheaply.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so like it was even less than cost price. I think in like some cases. But the reason being was like since the 1920s, the state and by the state, um, like I mean all of the aspects of the Irish state, in its kind of government, so the church and the civil service and the central bank, their big thing was to turn Irish people into a nation of house owners, and they couldn't do it through kind of market forces because Irish people didn't have the money to buy
yes,
houses.
yes, indeed.
Um, so so like in Cork in the 1930s, it's something like 30% of housing is like private housing. 70% of it is either public or like private rental. So this idea, this myth of Irish people being a nation of like homeowners, it took a long time for that to happen. And like in the end, it could only really happen through the state selling off public housing at very, very cheap rates.
Of
When
course,
that
yeah,
happened, private housing as a percentage of overall housing really started to then rise in Ireland and peaks around 1992 when it was around 80% of all housing was in private housing. Now it's 69%. It fell during the Celtic Tiger years, which is
yes,
counter kind of intuitive because the myth was that Irish people are like buying houses. It's going, well, they were, but the percentage of those who were actually homeowners drops during the whole period.
of
It
course,
peaks
yeah,
in it peaks in like 1990 in Ireland for the same reason. That's why home ownership in the former Eastern Bloc countries has now peaked because they also sold off all of their kind of public stock after 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you have much higher levels because there was much more higher kind of public housing to be kind of sold off. But that's falling now even there for the kind of very reason. So once you sell off all your kind of public housing, um, of course private housing then then kind of rises. The problem then is that you've now created a dysfunctional housing system. Because if you want everyone to be a homeowner, then you've got to give everyone the wages
Yes.
that will allow
Yes,
them
of
to
course.
afford a mortgage to buy one.
Of course.
And now that's simply not possible.
Well, that
So
went...
you can't have high home ownership in a low wage kind of economy, and that's what Ireland is. And that tension is what is being kind of played out here now.
Yeah.
It would make more sense to build more public housing, to take pressure off the private housing market and take pressure off the mortgage market. But that would then mean taking on banks, and the state has no intention
Of doing that.
taking on banks.
Of course
and
not.
The Ireland has the second highest mortgage interest rate in the EU. There's no reason for it, apart from profit.
Well, apart from, and I mean, this was what again was sold to people, and through economists and everybody else, self-appointed and otherwise, throughout what I would term the egotree, and I always have termed it no other word, of the Celtic Tiger years. That this idea that people had, a home stopped being something that you kind of lived in. A home was something that you bought and then you folded your arms and sat back and watched what it was worth going through the roof. You know, I bought this thing for 25,000 and now it's worth 900, this kind of stuff. And I mean, I think the result of that is what we see now is a generation growing up that are going to be living either in their mammy's box rooms or they're in this rental market that, you know, you're paying out huge percentage, 48 to 68% of the median wage going in rent.
Yeah, you know, and like, you know, this goes back to the class nature of the housing market, in that a way to tackle that is to not only build more kind of social housing, but to tackle the extortionate, you know, rates in terms of like mortgages themselves anyway.
Yes.
But that would mean taking on three very powerful economic power blocks in Ireland, which are banks, builders, and like landlords. You know,
Exactly.
And by landlords, landlordism is changing at the moment in Ireland. So after the crash, there was an influx and has been an influx of corporate landlords into Ireland. This is kind of new.
These are the so-called like vulture funds, or people that are buying up companies that are buying up entire blocks.
Yeah. So it's not just kind of vulture funds. It's more, these are investment trusts.
Yes.
And they buy up hundreds of units at a time, and then they kind of rent them out. So even though they're not a huge sector of the overall housing market, they do act as price setters in terms of rents, and by limiting, you know, individual housing sales,
Yes.
they act to kind of push up kind of prices. That's why kind of house prices have risen in the last year, even though sales are down.
Exactly.
Because those houses that are being sold, they're being sold at these kind of corporates who don't really, you know, who see it as a rental kind of investment
Situation.
They
yes.
will buy up those properties as long as rents are high. So if rents start dropping, that would affect their kind of profit margins.
Of course, yeah.
And what is being kind of protected is their kind of profit margins. Not margin.
Yeah,
you know?
and we don't want to upset those people at all costs. Can I just ask you, Conor, have you got a second piece of music for us?
Yeah, I'll go with it's Life Without Buildings, and their song "The Lean Over."
Life without buildings, not life without builders. Maybe slightly better, but anyway, life without buildings. And here goes "The Lean Over."
If I lose you, If I, baby, G, so G, you. If I lose you, the hump, if I lose you in the street, if I lose you in the street, if I lose you in the street, nah, if I
Life Without Buildings. That's the name of the band. And the song is called The Lean Over. And it's the second choice of my guest this week, Conor McCabe, who's been talking to us and explaining to us about, well, why we have a homeless crisis and why, in the midst of this homeless crisis, there are people out there doing fantastic work, sadly very badly needed because of what we're talking about. I'm just going to focus in on one here. Is like to read in the report about the penny dinners in Cork that was formed over 100 years ago. And yes, busier than ever, according to Katrina Toomey. Hungry bellies do certainly not equal full bellies. They do not equal equality. Our inequality that we've been talking about is going on. What is the root cause of this? What is the root cause of this?
Well, I mean, like, if people can't afford to feed themselves, then you've got a huge problem in terms of income. You know, if your current society is based upon market transactions, and it's saying that the market is the best way to distribute food, housing, services. It's through a market. That's the most, economical and the best way. When it's clearly not working, the arguments we hear back is that, well, that's their people's fault. That's their own fault. They're being lazy or they're not going to work it hard enough. And these are the arguments that are kind of thrown out forever, highly kind of disgusting ones. But it's their kind of presumption that the market will provide. The market rates and market wages will sort out all kinds of distribution problems. That's clearly not happening. If you've got people who can't afford to feed themselves, and you've got people who can't afford to properly house themselves, and then people can't afford to go to the doctor, you've got a huge problem in terms of how services
yes.
and food are being, distributed. But the ideology, especially of the things there, is that no, we cannot interfere with the market. People get wages and then they buy things. That's the best way to distribute these services, and it's clearly not. It's clearly not working.
When you have a situation where somebody is sort of saying, well, will I go to the doctor or buy food? And
exactly,
that speaks for itself, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And these are all costs that are then put on kind of doing business in Ireland. So going back to, if you're setting up a business in Ireland, some of the costs that you will be kind of hit with is going to be, if it's a physical kind of premise, it's going to be rent, which are quite high, insurance costs, which are crazy, and then there's rates then as well. So there's wages, but there's also these other three things, and the government, and also kind of bank loans, and the cost of actually borrowing. Ireland has one of the lowest rates of private business loans in Europe. In that, I think it's something like almost half of all businesses don't go for a bank loan. They try and find funding from somewhere else.
Okay.
Because banks will turn them down, or if you do kind of give them a loan, it's very high kind of interest rate. What that then means then is that is that businesses are being stifled from expanding, or from kind of being kind of set up by the lending policies of the banks in
of course
in Ireland.
Yeah.
If it's a business that's in a rural area, or it's not based in Dublin, and it's not kind of construction, they tend not to be interested. Now, this has huge effects in terms of jobs all across kind of Ireland. But the government's argument is that banks know best how to distribute credit. But they obviously don't, because if they did, we wouldn't have had the single largest bank crash in our history 12 years ago.
Indeed.
Banks gave over 400 billion in loans. It was the greatest misallocation of credit in the state's history. Hundreds of billions going into car parks, golf courses, hotels, the commercial buildings, which are all worthless by like 2009.
But we were listening to the experts. We were listening to
Exactly,
the experts, the self-appointed experts.
And it's these kind of very same experts, telling us that inequality is falling in the Ireland. This is absolutely madness. So if you want, there are certain things which people need. They're not wants, they're needs. It's not a case of I want food.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
I don't want, if I'm sick, it's not a choice. Well, it shouldn't be a choice.
Yeah.
As to whether
I go to the doctor or buy food for the kids. Yeah.
So
exactly.
Whatever those needs, as in like something which you may want as a consumer good, whatever your wants are, having them subject entirely to kind of market forces leads to this type of issue.
Of inequality,
where we have kind of charities who are stepping in trying to help out. But the problem itself is so vast that it does require proper state kind of management and state kind of input. But the Irish state this moment doesn't want to go there.
Is there a time coming when it will, or do you feel, and as all of us I think feel, that there is a time coming that it will have to, in some shape or form? It's easy to say, well, as long as Fine Gael are around, it looks so unlikely. But there will come a time where the state will have to intervene.
Yeah, but the generation that is coming up now, it's quite kind of exciting, just what they've done in the last kind of 5-6 years. If you look at what's happened in Ireland, since like 2012, really, that kind of generation, they helped kind of bring in same-sex marriage, bring in kind of abortion, and they smashed the two-party system.
Well, the two-party system is gone. It's now seen for what it is.
And that, and that kind of generation is, it isn't even 40 yet. And that's what they've done kind of so far. Yeah. So, as far as I can see, they're just getting started.
Yeah.
In terms of actually kind of taking on these things. And they have something which my generation, they wouldn't have had. They have wins.
Yes.
So they know what it's like to win, and they like it.
Yeah. And these things can be done.
Exactly. So to say this can be done. We can change things. We have changed things, and we're going to change things. So there's definite hope and optimism, out there for kind of changing Ireland.
Exactly.
And that's not down to any kind of party. Parties will ride the wave of that change, but parties very rarely initiate change.
Yes, no, it was the people themselves and younger people themselves.
Who will, So they're not going away anywhere, and they want to change things. So I'm kind of excited that I just see kind of what they'll do with it.
Well, do you know what? I think it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic that we're finishing up on a note of optimism, Conor, because that has to be that.
I think that this kind of generation is playing an absolute blinder.
Yeah, that we're no longer stuck with. And I think in many ways, and I like to think it anyway, that the water protests did play their part in, for example, forcing these two historical parties to cobble together. First, they had another name for it. What was it called? Confidence and Supply. And now it is what it always was from 2016.
There's no doubt in my mind that if we didn't have the water protests, we would have austerity part two at
Oh,
this moment.
absolutely. Much worse. Much worse.
They got the fright of their lives when they saw 100,000 people marching on the streets in Dublin, and they don't want to go back there again. They are terrified of it because
Yeah.
they know that they've got no kind of resistance to it, like, you know. So if that hadn't have happened, we would not be looking at a PUP payment of a 350 or any of those kinds of supports. They would not exist.
Yes, yeah. Good gracious me. Well, it doesn't bear thinking about. Have you a piece of music to take us out with, Conor?
Yeah, I'd like to end with some Nina and Simone, and I think a version of the Janisine song "Stars" live in Montreux is absolutely just like sublime. So I'll end with that, please.
Oh, that's fantastic, and I must say I'm delighted for Janice Ian to get a mention because, well, apart from her beautiful songs, she's a wonderful individual. I don't know if you ever looked her up on Facebook, and it is her, not some management company. And I'll tell you one thing: Janice Ian is on our side, Conor. There's no
Oh
question
no,
about that.
no, she's a great act. You know, she's a great activist herself, and she's a great activist in terms of
Fantastic.
gender.
Absolutely.
Issues as well, you know.
Yeah.
She's
Absolutely
brilliant.
fantastic. Listen, it has been a pleasure and a joy talking to you. And I hope
Oh,
we
thank you,
will
Mr.
meet
Thomas.
again sometime very soon in the real world.
Okay.
So we're going to play out here with Nina Simone and the wonderful Janice Ian song Stars, live at Montreux. And Conor, thank you so much.
Stars, they come and go. They come fast, they come slow. They go like the last light of the sun, all in a blaze. All you see is glory. But it gets lonely there when there's no one there to share. You can shake it away. If you hear a story, people lust for fame, like athletes in a game. They break their collarbones and come up swinging. Some of them are crowned, some of them are downed, some are lost and never found. But most have seen it all. They live their lives inside cafes and music halls. And they always have a story. Some make it when they are before the world has done its dirty job. Later on, someone will say you've had your day. Now you must make way. Don't they always? But you'll never know the pain of using a name you never owned. The years of forgetting what you know too well. That you who gave the crown have been let down. You tried to make amends without defending, perhaps pretending you never saw the eyes of young men at 25 who followed as you walked